Our final speaker in this session is Ms. Lindsey Riback. Lindsey is a project director at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, Montefiore Medical Center in the Bronx, New York. Her research focuses on the intersection of hepatitis C and HIV prevention, substance use disorder, and the criminal legal system in New York City and Kenya. She'll be here today to talk about correlates of non-fatal overdose and associated risk factors among people who inject drugs accessing harm reduction services in Kenya. Welcome.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I just want to start off, my presentation is not focused around gender differences, but I'll integrate it into my presentation. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge our participants who have volunteered their time and information to participate in the research. I don't have any disclosures myself, but these are, wrong direction. These are the ones listed for Dr. Akiyama, the principal investigator on this project. So what do we know? Given that injecting speeds up the time to intoxication, people who inject drugs are often at an increased risk for overdose. A recent global meta-analysis found that 2 in 5 people who inject drugs have experienced a non-fatal overdose in their lifetime, and 1 in 5 in the previous year. To take a step back in the context of people who use drugs, a systematic review and meta-analysis examining risk factors for non-fatal overdose among people who use drugs found no association between non-fatal overdose and gender in most of the studies. And the remaining 4, where there was an association, it was evenly split between men and women. There's many clinical, behavioral, and environmental factors that increase overdose risk. Clinical factors that have been associated with increased risk are previous treatment experiences, specifically opioid agonist therapy and hepatitis C diagnosis. Behavioral risk factors include needing assistance injecting, polysubstance use, which can be intentional or accidental, potentially affected by external environmental factors. It's like different substances in the supply. And then other environmental factors that increase risk are leaving one's environment, such as a carceral setting or detox setting, which can lead to reduced tolerance and also is a clinical factor as well. And then fentanyl, which can be introduced through the drug supply or through choice. When zeroing in on sub-Saharan Africa, there's limited data on non-fatal overdose. We've also heard this throughout the various presentations. A 2019 multi-stage systematic review and meta-analysis found that about half of people who inject drugs have ever experienced a non-fatal overdose, but this was only based on data from Kenya and Mauritius, so again, there's a lack of data. And there's no data on recent non-fatal overdose, just ever. And among 2 more recent studies from Kenya, one found 20% of people who inject drugs who are living with HIV have reported ever experiencing a non-fatal overdose, while another found 40% of those surveyed experienced a non-fatal overdose in the last 6 months. I also want to highlight some data from South Africa. So 38% of people who inject drugs in a cohort had experienced an overdose, and as well as in Tanzania, 34% of women who inject drugs had ever experienced an overdose. Sorry, non-fatal overdose. In the cohort of people who inject drugs living with HIV in Kenya, participants were also asked to self-identify risk factors and solutions or prevention tips. So some risk factors included polysubstance use, decreased tolerance due to incarceration, and then rushed injections, so consuming more than intended, potentially due to like law enforcement coming into the area that they're in. Similarly, they suggested injecting in group settings and incremental use, so using a bit at one time and then a little bit more later on, as strategies for preventing non-fatal overdose or overdose in general. However, more research is needed as these dynamics among people who inject drugs in sub-Saharan Africa are pretty limited. So now that we have a general sense of the risk factors, I also want to highlight findings from South Africa and Kenya. So research has found awareness of naloxone is limited, as other presenters have described. Those who were aware of naloxone did also report that it is very limited availability. In the South African cohort, about 3/4 of participants expressed interest in carrying naloxone once they were aware of its use, and just if it was available. Studies specifically among Kenyan people who inject drugs reported that typically it's only available in larger settings, larger dens, or through harm reduction agencies or peer educators. Currently, the Center for International Health, Education, and Biosecurity in Kenya is the main provider of naloxone in Kenya, but it's typically intramuscular. And it's, again, limited supply. Among the drop-in centers and MAC clinics that we work with, it's in short supply. It's given to the clinics, and they are in charge of the doses, essentially, but it can go to peer outreach workers. It can go to leaders of the dens or injection doctors to provide, and that's really important, especially when it's after hours and there's potentially no one else to respond. So about the study, we recruited 3,152 people who inject drugs from needle and syringe exchange programs in Nairobi, Coast, and Western region in Kenya using respondent-driven sampling. Participants are 18 years or older, history of ever injecting drugs, and then using a list, non-prescribed substances in the last year. Participants complete a biobehavioral survey, including demographics, migration patterns, sexual and substance use practices, and then a social network survey where they collect information on named injection partners. In addition to the surveys, they receive hepatitis C, B, and HIV testing, and then at follow-up, or people who are positive for HIV or Hep C are retained for follow-up, and they complete visits at month 4, 8, and 12, and then we have a negative cohort who will complete a one-time follow-up. At baseline, participants are asked, have you ever experienced a drug overdose? And then if yes, have you experienced one in the last 6 months? And those who come back for follow-up are also asked in the last 4 months, have they ever experienced one? The goal of this was to examine the impact of location, disease status, and injection behaviors on self-reported non-fatal overdose at baseline. So we had data available for most of the participants, 3,145, just similar to our cohort, predominantly male, and a mean age of 34 years. Almost half were recruited from coastal Kenya, followed by Nairobi and Western region, and just under 30% reported ever experiencing a non-fatal overdose, and about half of those individuals, almost 14%, experienced one in the last 6 months. In the analysis, we'll be looking at the last 6 months. So significant differences were noted relating to residing in coast, not residing in Nairobi, having hepatitis B, C, and HIV, Hep C co-infection, ever having been incarcerated, and using heroin, cocaine, khat, Bukizi, or Hypnol, or any polysubstance use in the last 30 days, and more frequent visits to the needle and syringe program in an average month, and currently being on methadone. And then we also did not find any differences with sex. Some more data as well, specifically about injection patterns. So injecting more, we found significant differences with injecting more times in the last 6 months, ever having injected someone else, receptive and passive equipment sharing in the last injection, injecting alone at least half the time and preferring to inject alone, which are 2 separate questions, injecting in a base camp or den, on the street, and then injecting in the arms, feet, neck, or thigh versus like arms or not, feet or not in the last 30 days. In the multivariate analysis, factors associated with increased odds of experiencing a non-fatal overdose were lifetime incarceration, polysubstance use in the last 30 days, more frequent injections in the last 30 days, receptive syringe sharing at the last injection, and injecting alone at least half the time, as well as base camp or dent, injecting in a base camp or dent, and in the feet. So what do we do with all this? Most of the risk factors associated with non-fatal overdose in our cohort, such as polysubstance use, shared supplies, and frequent injection, are associated with greater addiction severity, and also just reflects other findings in the literature. These demonstrate a need for integrating harm reduction, integrating overdose prevention strategies into harm reduction programs, and identifying optimal ways to engage individuals in these services. We found that individuals with non-fatal overdose did have more trips to an NSP in a month, which could be an opportunity to provide harm reduction messaging, but not everyone goes to one. So also just in harm reduction, like meeting people where they're at, so at outreach and high-risk injection locations, also encouraging never use alone strategies. So in the US and Canada, there's mobile apps and hotlines for people to reach out to when you're injecting. I'm about to run out of time, but also having increased access to naloxone. And this is really important in the current global climate. At the beginning, I mentioned we will have follow-up data on overdose over the course of their study participation. So we hope to do a time series analysis looking at that, and then also continuing bidirectional information exchange. So we have New York City naloxone kits that have made their way to Kenya. We've also been able to host some of our partners in Kenya in New York City to come to an overdose prevention site. And then this is just other work. And I'll keep going. Thank you. Sorry.